We start today with the FDA fully approving Pfizer's COVID vaccine. NBC News senior medical correspondent Dr. John Torres joining me now. Dr. John, this is the first COVID vaccine to get full approval. Can you explain the difference between emergency authorization and full authorization for the folks at home? What does this mean for them?
And Allison, you bet. And like you're right, this is the first COVID vaccine to get full approval. And the difference there being we have 3 vaccines right now that have the emergency authorization, the emergency use authorization. And that was given back December, January timeframe, a little after that. When they measured that and when they looked at the data there, their main point was to make sure that it was safe and effective and it outweighed the dangers of COVID itself. And so it was a little bit more of a lenient process. They used 2 months worth of data to do it. They did make sure it was safe and effective, but it was a little faster than their normal approval process because we're in the middle of a pandemic, the middle of an emergency. Well, now fast forward to August, and what they wanted are these companies to give them 6 months of data after their human trial volunteers ended up getting their vaccine. So Pfizer started submitting data back in May, submitted it through August, and finally said, okay, now we've given you the data, go ahead and look at it. The FDA went through, crunched all the data, and they did a few things. Number 1, made sure it's safe. Number 2, make sure it's effective. But number 3, they're also looking at the manufacturing plants, the factories, to make sure that those are up to snuff, that the quality of those factories and what they're putting out is sufficient. And they're going to make sure that these manufacturers follow patients for the next months and years to make sure it remains safe. The difference there, probably the big difference for people overall, is this is a permanent approval. This is something that doesn't just happen during the pandemic, but it's permanent. And like most other medications, you're going to see it being able to be ordered through your doctor's office, given to you at pharmacies like it is now, but even more so. And so it's going to be even advertised. They gave it a name, Allison. It's Comirnaty, which we haven't had not had a name before, but that's the new name for it.
Comirnaty. I can picture the commercials on cable news right now, right, with the long list of things to ask your doctor about, those pharmaceutical commercials
Exactly.
we were bombarded with. So, Dr. John, the Pfizer vaccine only started rolling out last December. There are some concerns that this approval is happening a little bit too fast. Here's the FDA's acting commissioner addressing that today.
We want to underscore that our efforts to move as quickly as possible have in no way sacrificed scientific standards or the integrity of our process. Approving the vaccine as rapidly as possible while ensuring a rigorous and thorough review has been our top priority.
What's your take, Dr. John? How would you explain this one to a concerned patient who thinks, man, that happened quick?
Yeah, Allison, it's interesting. A few weeks ago, I actually had Dr. Peter Marks on my Doc to Doc series, and that's the gentleman you saw in the picture there. His job is to make sure these vaccines are safe. His job is part of that division to make sure that they approve these appropriately. And what he told me is typically after they get all the paperwork and all the data, it typically takes them 5 months to fully approve it. And that's because it's a small department, small part of the FDA that does that, and they do it on their own time scale. Well, he said now because of the pandemic and the fact they need these vaccines, they're putting all hands on deck. They ended up putting a lot of resources into getting this approved, and they wanted to do it safely, effectively, with the same standards they had before, but much faster by putting a lot more help in there, a lot more manpower in there. And that's what they did. And that's why they were able to do it in 3 months instead of 5 months. And so you're seeing here a faster approval process, but didn't cut any corners, didn't go shy in any safety measures, is the same as before, just had a lot more people looking at it.
Dr. John, full approval also paves the way for more mandates. The Pentagon confirming today service members will be required to get the COVID vaccine. Take a listen.
Now that the Pfizer vaccine has been approved, the department is prepared to issue updated guidance requiring all service members to be vaccinated.
New York City is doing the same for all of its school teachers and staff. Do you expect to see more institutions jumping on board here, and would you like them to?
You know, I think we are going to see more institutions jumping on board after my 32 years in the military, where we had shots for just about anything, because on a moment's notice, you could go anywhere in the world and you need to be protected. That's the bottom line. Well, now we're here in a pandemic and everybody needs to be protected. And so a lot of these institutions, a lot of these organizations are saying now that it's approved, which is what we were waiting for, we can start mandating it because they've looked at it, they've vetted it, they've seen that it's safe and effective, and it's going to be here for a long time. So let's go ahead and get people vaccinated vaccinated, get this pandemic more under control. I think you're going to see that move over to the civilian sector as well. You can see more organizations, more businesses start to mandate it to make sure that, number one, that their employees are safe, but also anybody that might be taken care of is safe as well. And that way, hopefully, again, Allison, like we mentioned, the pandemic will get over sooner rather than later by getting more people vaccinated.
All right, Dr. John, thank you so much for all of your medical wisdom today. We always appreciate it.
You bet.
Over 170 million Americans are now fully vaccinated. President Biden celebrating that milestone, along with the FDA's approval of the Pfizer vaccine.
For the past several weeks, my administration has imposed new vaccine requirements on federal workers, the armed forces, people who work in federal medical facilities, and nursing home workers. Governors, mayors, and private sector leaders have done the same. These new requirements and incentives are accelerating vaccinations once again.
NBC News White House correspondent Kelly O'Donnell has more.
Good afternoon, Allison. A long-awaited FDA approval for one of the COVID vaccines, the one made by Pfizer. And this is opening up new opportunities for the White House, as well as likely some new requirements for the public. The president is saying that those who have hesitated because they wanted more science, they wanted to know that the Pfizer vaccine was fully tested and reviewed and given what is considered the gold standard of medical and scientific approval, the FDA approval, that now that that's happened, it should be encouragement and really a green light for those who are unvaccinated to step forward and get their shots. That's an argument we're hearing from the president. While he's been saying that message for a long time, it's geared up today with that approval. He also says because of that approval, expect he will push for more requirements, certainly using those through the federal government, like we now expect it will go forward with all military personnel. They've been telegraphing that for a few weeks now. And he'll look for other ways, agency by agency, to require vaccinations and use whatever federal powers he has to try to increase vaccinations as well. The president's also encouraging private business to use the FDA stamp of approval as a way to compel their employees or to set up rules in dealing with the public to have vaccinations be part of the plan. That's a big change over the months here of the Biden White House. Originally, they were looking at this as being very much a voluntary choice, but with the way the virus itself has acted with the Delta variant, they now believe strongly that incentives and in some places mandates for the vaccine are really required to get the virus under control. So expect that the president will use that as a new tool in addition to setting up incentives and requirements. And they do expect that the Moderna vaccine, second in the pipeline, could also have FDA approval in the next month or so. So that would add to this argument that with FDA approval, eliminating some of the concerns and questions that the unvaccinated have had. That's the message coming out of the Biden White House. Allison?
So what do people on the street think about Pfizer's full FDA approval? Take a look.
I hope that the approval by the FDA today means that some hesitant people who were hesitant about being vaccinated will take this as a sign that it is safe, because I know that some people were waiting for that emergency to not be an emergency approval anymore.
I know that a lot of people were apprehensive about the vaccine, and one of the excuses that folks used was that it wasn't FDA approved, and that excuse is gone now.
Hopefully it'll convince some people who weren't ready to be vaccinated to be vaccinated.
I'm hesitant because I feel like it's still new and, it just was approved today, so I'm still a little iffy on it. I'm not really saying I'm going to do it or not going to do it. I'm just still thinking. So we'll
this
see.
Didn't change your mind?
No, not yet.
I've been trying to convince her for the past year. So to me, the science is there. This leaves no questions unturned.
But you have those close to you that have coronavirus.
Correct.
But you still will not get a vaccine.
Not yet.
Even though it's now fully approved.
I'm still thinking.
And what are you thinking? What's the hesitancy?
I'm just not too comfortable with it yet.
Yeah, personally, my own family has been waiting for it to be FDA approved. Not myself, but a lot of the people in my life are waiting to hear that it's approved by the government. I have not talked to them yet, but I am looking forward to having that conversation.
The FDA approval kind of would help somebody kind of think it's safer maybe, but at the same time, I'm like, everybody's set in their ways. Now, it doesn't really, it's frustrating to realize it doesn't really, to me, it doesn't really matter that much.
Hopefully encourage like businesses or schools to, you know, have more of a foot to stand on when it comes to requiring the vaccine.
I think people really get concerned about what is approved and what is not, and, you know, just in general. But personally, I don't like wearing a mask, so if it betters my chances of not getting COVID, I'm all for it.
Our staff is exhausted, you know, and we really, it's hard to watch them go through this again. And for a lot of our staff, it's like PTSD.
Staffing so thin in Kentucky, the hospitals might need military-style MASH units to treat all the COVID patients coming in. Meanwhile, a school district there shut down with more than 150 students testing positive or exposed to the virus. NBC News correspondent Cal Perry has the latest from Hazard, Kentucky.
Allison, it is a deteriorating situation here in eastern Kentucky and in southern West Virginia. I give you that geographical area because that's what the Appalachian healthcare system covers. That is the area that they are in charge of. We're talking about 13 hospitals, some 6,000 employees. There are 32 ICU beds in those hospitals, those 13 hospitals. Every single one of those ICU beds is now full. They are at capacity. You add to that, there is a staffing shortage of both nurses and doctors. In fact, in this healthcare system, it was made mandatory for people to give vaccines. A number of people choosing to go home instead of taking those vaccines, which has forced this hospital system and the hospital behind me to change the way that they're doing things. Take a listen.
We are planning contingently how to take care of people with reduced staff. We may need to alter the things that we do, the way we care for people. We may need to end up looking at things like MASH units, you know, behaving like you do in the military. We're not there today, but we have these discussions and preparations, and we will change and do what we need to do to take care of the patients that need us.
It is, of course, not just the hospitals that have officials concerned, but it is also the schools. In the county next to me, Knott County, schools have been shut down since last week. There were 150 children that either tested positive or were exposed to the virus and had to be sent home. One high school football player actually ending up in the hospital. Part of this is about mask mandates. Take a listen to what the superintendent had to say about masks.
We have the mask mandate, and we have had really good success with that in our schools. But when I get out in the community, I see that in a lot of public areas, there's people are not masking up throughout our county. So I'm not sure if a lot of the contamination occurred outside of our schools.
Of course, the hope is that with this new approval of the Pfizer vaccine, more people will become vaccinated. But when you look at the stats in this part of the country, there are some counties in eastern Kentucky that are below 40% vaccination rate. That is what has officials concerned. That's why everybody is on such a high state of alert at the hospitals. And the area as well is a very rural area. You're talking about a 3-hour drive to the nearest metropolitan hospital. That is a concern here as well, again, as these hospitals continue to swell with COVID patients.
A recipe for disaster. A Texas hospital administrator describing the return to school. More than 3,500 students in that state have contracted COVID so far. And today the kids are back in class in Houston, the state's largest school district. Masks are required there. The Texas Supreme Court declining to back the governor's ban on school mask mandates. NBC News correspondent Morgan Chesky is in Houston with more.
Yeah, Allison, good afternoon from Houston, Texas, where hundreds of thousands of students had their first day of school today. We're standing outside of Parker Elementary. We were here bright and early, and I got to tell you, it was quite a sight to see dozens of kids and their parents lining up the sidewalks outside the school with masks on, knowing the drill for the upcoming school year. This is following a decision that was made district-wide in defiance of Texas Governor Greg Abbott's executive order that they would be masking up for in-person learning. And that, of course, is a drastic step from what we saw last year when COVID-19 forced so many kids to have to go through virtual learning, which parents and administrators both agree is not ideal for especially these young kids at the elementary level. So today, with the masks on, they had their temperatures checked before walking inside, where hopefully they'll be able to maintain in-person learning for at least the near-term future. We do know that districts across the state of Texas already facing some significant hurdles with this Delta variant wreaking such havoc across the state. Hospitals are being pushed to the breaking point. Rural districts, in some cases, have already completely switched to virtual learning, at least for the temporary basis, because they feel that keeps kids safer. I had a chance to speak to administrators, the superintendent of Houston's own school district, who tells me that he believes the science says that masks are keeping kids safe, and that's what they're standing behind for this upcoming school year.
We think it's consistent with the data. We know what masking has done across the country. We also know where the COVID numbers are right now. And if you look at those two data pieces, we believe it makes sense to ensure that our students and staff are masked on a daily basis. And again, that is one mitigation strategy that we believe that will make a major difference moving forward.
Now, 2 quick points to make. Number one, the only reason the school district was able to lawfully issue that mask mandate is because the Texas Supreme Court issued a stay against Texas Governor Greg Abbott's executive order that banned local municipalities and districts just like Houston from being able to create their own mask rules. So at least for the short term, while that is being challenged in court, districts across the state can essentially put measures in place to keep their students safe. In the meantime, I did ask the superintendent, is Houston going to follow suit like a district such as New York City, where they will mandate Pfizer's now FDA-approved vaccine for all staff to at least have one shot by the end of September? He says that is certainly something that could be discussed, although he said that discussion is not ongoing as of now.
NBC News Now correspondent Simone Boyce. She has the headlines from NBCNews.com. Hi, Simone.
Hey, Allison, we start with some tragic news out of Tennessee, where massive flooding left 22 people dead and dozens missing. Authorities say several of the missing are children. Floods coming after the area saw a record 17 inches of rain in just 24 hours. And New York Governor Andrew Cuomo serving out his final day in office. Cuomo's resignation following a sexual harassment scandal goes into effect just before midnight. And an aide for the governor says he will not run for office again. In his farewell address today, he once again condemned the New York Attorney General's investigation into the allegations as politicized. And now an incredible story, an Afghan woman giving birth to a child on a U.S. evacuation flight. The new mother going into labor during the flight due to complications related to low blood pressure. Airmen from the 86th Medical Group rushed on board and delivered the baby in the cargo bay as the plane landed. Mom and baby were both taken to the hospital and seem to be doing okay. Well, Mayim Bialik will step in as Jeopardy host for now. Sony Pictures Television says she'll fill in as guest host when production begins this week. She's scheduled to tape 3 weeks of episodes, and then some additional guest hosts will be announced. The move comes after Mike Richards stepped down as the show's new host after past offensive comments surfaced. So that story is not going away anytime soon. All right, and now in Tokyo, athletes are gearing up for the Paralympic Games. Starting tomorrow, 4,400 athletes from 98 countries will compete in sports ranging from swimming to cycling to basketball. New events at the Paralympics this year include badminton and taekwondo. And as with the Olympics, unfortunately, all events will take place without spectators. But you can watch the games on NBC and stream across all NBC platforms. Allison, I'll send it back your way.
All right, Simone, thank you. It could have been a whole lot worse. Henri weakening from a hurricane to a tropical storm, now a tropical depression, but still hitting the Northeast with plenty of rain and wind, taking out trees and turning off the lights. Power crews in Rhode Island cutting up those trees and trying to fix those down lines today. NBC News correspondent Kathy Parks in Narragansett, Rhode Island. Kathy, more than 40,000 people don't have power in that state. How long could they be out? That's the big worry at this stage.
Hey there, Allison. So we are told that it could take a couple of days, but the hope is to get the majority of customers back online sometime tomorrow afternoon. But we have seen crews out here all day today. They have made a lot of progress. In fact, behind me, you probably notice a lot of debris. The power line is still down, so obviously the power is still out in this community. They haven't had power since noon yesterday when the storm started moving inland. And, you know, the ground is already saturated from a lot of the storm storms, past storms, and then you add in the intense wind gusts that we were hit with yesterday as Henri moved to this area. That was just a bad combination all around. So take a listen to one resident here who lives in this community who kind of described riding out this storm. Take a listen.
Woke up, tons of rain. The rain actually went down and the winds just picked up, and we were begging for no lights to go out. They flicked, and next thing you know, all the lights went out. We stepped outside and saw that mess in the road, and we figured we were going to have to hunker down for a while without any power.
And Allison, I can tell you that crews have really picked up the pace with the cleanup effort. We were out here really early in the morning. There was a massive tree that was down. Obviously, that has been cleared away. They still do need to get the power lines up and running. I do see a utility truck headed this way. Obviously, they were well prepared for the storm. They had help on so many levels. They also had federal help as well ahead of the storm. So obviously they learned a lot from past storms, and they were ready to tackle whatever was coming their way. But fortunately, it looks like the brunt of the storm missed the Rhode Island area.
Yeah, Kathy, they certainly had their work cut out for them. I was watching you earlier on MSNBC, as you mentioned, with that enormous tree behind you. So they have made some progress, at least clearing the street out a little bit. I know that's one of the biggest things they're dealing with, those enormous trees, so tough to clear out. I know another concern has been flooding, and you still had some rain there today. How worried are folks there about that?
You know, what's interesting with this storm, we were on the east side of the storm, so we didn't get too much flooding. In fact, we were by the shore, by the beach yesterday, and the waves were just crashing against the seawall. There was a little bit of spillover, but shortly after 12 o'clock, noon, the rain started to subside. We did get hit with some heavy bands of rain, but it was just those wind gusts. I think at times the wind gusts were so intense it reached up to 50 miles per hour in some places when it made landfall in westerly Rhode Island, about 30 miles or 20 miles west of here. It was 60 miles per hour. So that is kind of what we were dealing with. So it was just those winds, not so much the rain. So we're not really dealing with the flooding, but rain is still in the forecast later on this evening, Allison.
All right. Good to hear that at least flooding is not a major issue there. And to be fair and frank, I suppose, Kathy, I think we're all expecting this storm could have been a whole lot worse. So glad to hear we're talking about power lines and trees and not lives at this stage of the game. Thank you so much for your reporting. NBC News meteorologist Michelle Grossman is tracking tropical depression Henri. All right, so Michelle, when will Henri finally say au revoir to the Northeast? He wasn't so bad, but I think we'll all be pretty happy to see him go.
Yeah, it's like that unwanted guest, like not terrible, but like it's time for you to go. So that's going to be Tuesday morning, a little bit left over Tuesday morning, and then it's out of here. We're going to say bye-bye. Okay. But yeah, Kathy kind of summed that up perfectly. Like most of that heavy rain fell on the western side of the storm, so they were sort of out of it in terms of flooding, but they are going to get some storms today, even some heavy banding to finish us out before we finally say goodbye. But let's take a look because we are still looking at some heavy rain falling in some spots. The storm surge wasn't bad. That was good news. And also the winds weren't too bad either. We've had so many overperforming storms that it was really nice to get a none or underperforming storms in terms of Henri. So the rainfall, well, we saw over 7 inches in New York City, Jamesburg 8.36. That's a lot of rain on saturated grounds. Surf City, that's in Long Beach Island, 5.81 inches. So this is what satellite and radar looks like right now. It's still spinning. It was such a crazy path, right? We mentioned that unwanted guess. Well, it's a crazy guess because it came on shore, then it sort of stopped, and then it sort of took a turn towards the west. And then it sort of just sat and spun. And that's what we saw yesterday, early today, but we're finally seeing it on the move up to 9 miles per hour. So picking up some speed and moving off to the east, but still bringing some rain. You see those yellows and even some reds bringing that heavy rain. So 24 million still at risk for the potential for some periods of some heavy rain before it moves out of here Tuesday morning. There's your flash flood watch where you see the green. So parts of Vermont, also Connecticut, parts of New York into into Massachusetts, also Rhode Island. So additional rain forecast. It's not going to take much to see some flooding. So even though we're seeing some small amounts on this map, this even looks better from an hour ago. It's only going to take like half an inch to see some flooding in some spots. So, Allison, yes, as you mentioned, thankfully this was an underperforming storm. We still have a long way to go. We haven't reached peak season, so we will continue to watch the tropics. But it looks like at least for the next 5 days, we're going to be relatively quiet.
All right, we'll take 5 days of relative quiet, that's for sure. Michelle, thank you so much.
Yeah.
House back to work on Capitol Hill today. Democrats taking on the $3.5 trillion budget resolution. But a group of moderate Democrats is putting up a roadblock, writing in a Washington Post op-ed, "We are firmly opposed to holding the president's infrastructure legislation hostage to reconciliation, risking its passage and the bipartisan support behind it. We can walk and chew gum just as the Senate did." NBC News political correspondent Ali Vitale is on the Hill. So, Ali, Speaker Pelosi wants to move those two bills in tandem, setting an October 1st date to get both of them done. But those moderates want to vote on infrastructure first. So what's the latest in this Democratic tug of war tonight?
Yeah, Allison, there's never a good time to have a family feud spill out publicly, but certainly not right now, because they're trying to do a lot in a really short period of time here. The House is back in the middle of its August recess, earlier than we thought we were going to see them. And what they're trying to do is effectively over the course of tonight, as they just reopen the floor, into tomorrow, they're trying to tick through this list of policy items. It's not just infrastructure. They're also looking to push ahead on voting rights. And then there's also going to be a series of briefings on Afghanistan, because lawmakers are finally back in town physically in person. But what we're seeing among the moderates, the 9 of them who are trying to push Nancy Pelosi to change her choreography here of how she wants to do these bills procedurally, they are saying that they would like to see a vote first on the bipartisan infrastructure bill that has already passed the Senate. They say that they need to see that vote sooner, and that's the thing that they're using to potentially hold up their support of the next phase of this, which is that larger $3.5 trillion infrastructure bill that doesn't necessarily fit the traditional definition of infrastructure, but that it has a whole laundry list of progressive policy priorities in it. Take a listen, for example, to what one of those key moderates, Congressman Gadamer, said this morning on CNBC.
Well, you pass the 3.5 first so that you can get to your infrastructure bill.
No, I don't think we can do that. I mean, we've got to get infrastructure done. And listen, the next package, the reconciliation package, while you're referring to, I think in the end, we're going to have to debate that for months. It's a significant, important investment in the country. There's going to be lots of differences, but that's okay. That's what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to debate these things. All we're saying is, like, let's get infrastructure done first.
And Allison, a few things to remember here. 9 might not seem like a very large number, but it is when you consider the fact that Speaker Pelosi is working with really tight margins here. She can only afford to lose 3 members of her caucus, so there is some leverage in being part of that 9. That being said, as Speaker Pelosi was just walking to the floor a few minutes ago, one of our producers caught up with her. She said she has spoken with members of this moderate group. They are talking, and as I'm watching Twitter and keeping track of what's going on as lawmakers go in and out of the floor now that they're physically back here on the Hill, it does seem like there might be some wheeling and dealing behind the scenes to try to compromise to make sure that this bipartisan bill can be brought up by early October. That's the deadline that you mentioned that Speaker Pelosi had previously laid out there, but also in a way to try to keep her caucus on board, because she is going to need, as I said, as many of them as she can have, because the margins here are just so tight.
Yeah, she doesn't have a whole lot of wiggle room. Let's talk about the Senate for a moment. Ali, they're on recess, but Senators Joe Manchin, Kyrsten Sinema, both weighing in on the reconciliation process. What are they saying to lawmakers in the House?
Well, they're giving a little bit of cover to this group of 9 moderates who are saying that they want to see the bipartisan infrastructure bill voted on immediately. Take a look, for example, at what Joe Manchin tweeted out earlier today. He said that the House should, quote, come together to pass the historic bipartisan infrastructure package before considering the Democratic budget resolution. Remember, that's the opposite of what Speaker Pelosi wants to do. He goes on to say he urges his colleagues in the House to move swiftly to get this legislation to the president's desk for his signature. And meanwhile, a spokesperson for Senator Kyrsten Sinema of Arizona, one of those other moderates who has also argued against that $3.5 trillion price tag, weighed in as well, saying that what happens in the House will have no impact on Sinema's views about what is best for our country, including the fact that she will not support a budget reconciliation bill that costs $3.5 trillion. Look, ultimately, all of this is about leverage. Speaker Pelosi thinking that if she crafts the choreography this way, it'll keep the pressure on the Senate to ultimately pass the second phase of this that they have not yet contended with. That being said, beware of that $3.5 trillion number, because the last time Leader Schumer was on the Hill, we spoke with him in a press conference. He said he was wed to the policy priorities that are in this bill, but not necessarily to the price tag, and that's where the compromise is going to come in. Allison?
All right. Ali Vitale on Capitol Hill. Always great to see you.
You too.
Proud Boys leader Henri, known as Enrique, sentenced to 155 days in jail for burning a Black Lives Matter flag stolen from historic black church during a pro-Trump demonstration last December. NBC News justice correspondent Pete Williams joining me now. Pete, Tarrio also pleaded guilty to gun possession charges. Could you tell us about what happened back in December and at his sentencing?
Sure. It's the December 12th rally. It was a raucous pro-Trump rally here in Washington, and at some point, some of the Proud Boys did go into this church, one of the oldest black churches in Washington, and steal a Black Lives Matter banner, which Tory admitted then that he helped to set on fire. Now, he said at the time that he did it, he was proud of it, but subsequently he has told the judge that he was profoundly sorry, that it was a great mistake, that he didn't know it came from a church. The judge didn't buy that he didn't know it came from a church, since he was standing right in front of the church at the time, and also that it said Asbury United Methodist Church on it. So the judge didn't accept his claims that he was sorry and that he expressed remorse. The second offense is possessing 2 high-capacity ammunition magazines, or the clips that go into a gun. They could hold up to 60 rounds apiece. The prosecutor said that he brought them when he came back to Washington on January 4th to sell to somebody else, and that he was back in town here in advance of the January 6th protests that ended up going to the U.S. Capitol. So for both those things, he's sentenced to 5 months in jail. He'll have to start reporting for his sentence in just a couple of weeks on Labor Day, actually.
Pete, federal prosecutors were recommending 90 days in jail. Why did the judge sentence him to more than that? I'm guessing that lack of remorse probably played in.
That played a part of it, too. There was also a point at the hearing today where the senior pastor from the church spoke and said, you know, a lot of these parishioners are older people, and the thought of people, white men, she said, breaking into the church, setting this banner on fire, seemed to them especially frightening, racist, memories of the Ku Klux Klan. So I think that may have played a role in the judge's thinking here, too. Basically, he didn't buy that this was remorseful, and he said it had a big impact on the community.
All right, Pete Williams, thank you.
You bet.
Getting out of Afghanistan, only half the struggle for Americans and our allies. From there, the journey is filled with more delays, bureaucratic red tape. 5,000 Afghan evacuees have landed at America's Ramstein Air Base in Germany. NBC News foreign correspondent Matt Bradley shows us what they're dealing with there.
Yeah, Allison, well, we've heard all day from U.S. officials describing how U.S. citizens are the priority. I spoke with several U.S. citizens and others who have green cards here. They're very anxious to get to the United States, but also very, very angry at the ordeal that they had to go through, both at the airport and after that, because this isn't their first destination. They've actually come to here at Ramstein through some other destinations outside of Europe. And here they're being stalled by a massive bureaucracy, even if they're American citizens. Here's what one Afghan-American gentleman had to tell me. Are you angry, sir?
Yes, I am angry.
Angry at the Americans?
I'm completely angry because they could have managed this much better way. Because I lived in the U.S. in the past 18 years, and I know they can do it.
But you know, Allison, amidst all of this, there's still a sense of hope, because once the Afghans do reach here, they're safe. They have food, water, medical care, temporary shelters. But at the same time, what they don't have is information. They don't know how their case is being handled, when they're going to leave, or even where they're going to go after this. But at the same time, there is this palpable sense of relief that they managed to make it out of Kabul. Here's what one of the men who is leading this operation here told me.
there is nothing more amazing to watch evacuees come into this process. The smiles, the excitement. They're tired, they're exhausted, but then when you see them, you're able to feed them, you get them a little bit of shelter, and then they're playing soccer, and it's just awesome.
You know, Alice, I want to tell you about a really special moment that happened on Saturday. There was an Afghan woman who actually went into labor on the flight to here at Ramstein Air Base, and she was so close to giving birth that the plane landed while she was still in labor. They didn't have time to get her off the plane into a hospital. So medical staff here went on board the plane and helped her deliver the baby right here at the air base on the tarmac inside a C-17 transport plane. I spoke with the 28-year-old very young nurse who managed to do the whole thing with the help of some other Afghans and her very courageous team. Here's what she had to tell me about this extraordinary experience.
The word we had gotten was that the baby had delivered in flight, and we got on board and realized that she was still in the throes of labor and had a good team of other Afghan women, refugees, supporting her. So I just delivered the baby. The baby came out screaming. Thankfully, mom and baby are doing well.
So, yeah, Allison, as you can see, some very real moments of anger and despair, but also some rare moments of beauty and hope here at Ramstein Air Base.
Vice President Kamala Harris in Singapore dealing with the fallout from Afghanistan on the first day of her Southeast Asia trip. Here's NBC News global correspondent Raf Sanchez.
Allison, Vice President Harris's trip to Southeast Asia was supposed to be about the future. It was supposed to be about showing that America is pivoting away from the Middle East, from the wars of the post-9/11 era, and focusing anew on Asia, on the challenge of confronting China, and on America's allies in the region. Unfortunately for the White House, this trip has really been overshadowed by what is going on in Afghanistan, the most serious foreign policy crisis the Biden-Harris administration has faced so far. Vice President Harris was in Singapore, where she announced a number of new agreements on trade, on COVID, but the reporters traveling with her understandably wanted to ask her about Afghanistan. The vice president said there will be time to learn the lessons from this chaotic withdrawal, but that the focus right now needs to be on the evacuation and on getting both Americans and Afghan allies out. Take a listen to what she had to say.
There's no question there will be and should be a robust analysis of what has happened. But right now, there's no question that our focus has to be on evacuating American citizens, Afghans who worked with us, and vulnerable Afghans, including women and children. That has to be our primary focus.
Now, the vice president was standing at President Biden's side last week as he spoke about Afghanistan, as he defended his decision to withdraw. We don't have a really strong sense what her own position was in the internal administration deliberations on this major foreign policy issue. The vice president is in Singapore now. She is heading to Vietnam later in the week. We'll be hoping to draw more attention to these issues of the American pivot to Asia. But Allison, she may find that reporters there want to draw comparisons between the fall of Kabul and the fall of Saigon back in the 1970s. So this issue of Afghanistan may continue to overshadow the vice president's trip. Allison?
An inherited war, a quick collapse of the capital, chaotic evacuations. Are we talking about Afghanistan today or the fall of Saigon back in 1975? And is that comparison fair? NBC News Now correspondent Maura Barrett takes a look.
America's withdrawal from Afghanistan ended up in a chaotic evacuation. The image of a helicopter lifting off above the U.S. Embassy in Kabul has drawn comparison to the fall of Saigon in 1975. House GOP conference chair Elise Stefanik tweeted, "This is Joe Biden's Saigon."
This is President Biden's Saigon moment.
Meanwhile, Biden and his team rejects the Saigon analogy.
This is manifestly not Saigon.
It's not hard to see why the comparison resonates. Both the fall of Kabul and the fall of Saigon concluded generation-long wars. Both capitals taken over more quickly than the U.S. expected, both evacuations chaotic and heart-wrenching, and both President Ford and Biden inherited the wars from their predecessors.
But let's look at the details.
This is 1973, 2 years before the fall of Saigon. U.S. combat forces leaving Vietnam. Fast forward to 1975, Americans noticed the inevitable collapse of South Vietnam as North Vietnamese troops advanced. The evacuation started on April 4th, but the fall of Saigon on April 30th, 1975 was still a great panic. With sea lanes blocked, helicopter was the only possible transport. Within 24 hours, 7,000 people, 5,500 of them Vietnamese, were relocated to U.S. ships in the South China Sea.
Just last month, Biden asserted that history wouldn't repeat itself.
There's going to be no circumstance where you see people being lifted off the roof of an embassy of the United States from Afghanistan.
A few weeks later, comparisons of Saigon and Kabul became a meme. Biden admitted the situation in Kabul was amounting to one of the, quote, most difficult airlifts in history. More than 28,000 people have been evacuated since August 14th, according to Biden in a press conference Sunday. The Taliban has control over the whole country and is blocking the roads to the Kabul airport. Thousands of Afghans are desperately waiting on the other side of the fence, including translators, former employees of the U.S. government, and their families.
There is no way to evacuate this many people without pain and loss of heartbreaking images you see on television.
While the optics might be strikingly similar, not everybody agrees the comparison is fair.
I think the analogy between the fall of Saigon, the fall of Kabul, is not valid for the most part. What was happening in Vietnam was a major, perhaps the major issue in American politics from the mid-1960s until the early 1970s. With Saigon, lots of people thought, especially, I should say, conservatives, thought the United States should never have, quote, abandoned the South Vietnamese government, should have kept fighting there. Whereas in Afghanistan, the withdrawal was something which both parties supported. Biden's only responsibility, I think, right now is to handle this withdrawal in a humane and efficient way.
So what can we learn from Vietnam with regard to refugee resettlement?
After the fall of the Vietnam War, a wave of 130,000 refugees came to the U.S. President Ford spent $450 million on Vietnamese refugees. That's the equivalent of more than $2 billion today. The refugees first settled in assimilation centers and then dispersed, often living in neighborhoods around the country called Little Saigon. Over the next 20 years, thanks to reforms and asylum policies, another 500,000 Vietnamese refugees found home in the United States, often braving dangerous journeys to get here. It was not without controversy. Now, in Afghanistan, 6,000 troops are back in Kabul to help with the evacuation. 11,000 people have been airlifted over the weekend, but there's a long way to go. According to the International Refugee Assistance Project, over 18,000 special immigration visa applicants are waiting in line, plus 70,000 family members eligible for the program. Biden is allocating $500 million for, quote, unexpected urgent refugee and migration needs.
There are people who've helped us in this mission. There are people whose lives are going to be at risk, and we have to do everything that we can to bring them to safety.
America's always been the country that opens our heart. And by the way, refugees to this country have always been the ones that are extremely entrepreneurial.
It remains to be seen if the U.S. will accept as many Afghan refugees as we did from Vietnam, and fulfill the moral obligation promised by members of both political parties.
Texas Republicans trying to advance the restrictive voting bill again today. A State House committee hearing public testimony on sweeping election changes this morning as the clock ticks on a second special session. NBCNews.com senior reporter Jane Tim joining me now. Jane, that hearing at the State House today ran several hours. What were the highlights?
You know, it's actually still going. They took a break to go to the House floor,
Really?
But we're expected to go back and keep hearing testimony. You know, it feels a little bit like a rerun of the July hearing on this very bill. Critics, a lot of the same people, familiar faces and names who are coming out in support or in criticism of this bill. They swapped in their own version of the election bill in place of the Senate bill, exactly the same legislative maneuver we saw back in July. But what we are seeing is just less people out there. And I think it's a little bit more abbreviated in general, in part because we've been fighting about this bill for 3 sessions now. This is probably the 3rd, at least, House hearing on this piece of legislation. And also COVID is surging in the House. There's definitely talk about masks, There is no mask mandate in the Texas House, so I think advocates were a little bit more cautious this time about maybe not packing buses full and sending lots and lots of people to the legislature. Definitely a smaller crowd. Of course, it is a Monday, and the last hearing was a Saturday. That one ran all weekend long.
Jane, the State House and Senate are back at work today, reporting the House could pass these voting restrictions within a matter of days. A pretty big blow to Democrats who've spent months trying to block it. What are you hearing from the Democrats today? Any more delay tactics up their sleeves?
You know, I think we might just see it. Democrats have been spent the weekend really pushing back on the idea that Republicans had achieved quorum last week. Let's take a listen to what one of the leaders of the quorum break, what he's saying about that quorum.
Make no mistake, if there is a quorum, I think we're going down the wrong road here. We already see Republicans acting, at least with the bills in committee, no negotiations, no discussion, no public testimony. They're treating the committee process as if it's the floor, which means the bills could be heard in 40 minutes. That's not being bipartisan or pragmatic.
So we're waiting to see what happens when they actually gavel back in on that session. I did see moments ago that there is a lawmaker who intends to essentially go on the floor and say, I don't think there's quorum, and demand that roll call and actually make people put a name to all of their votes to see if it's really there. So I think Democrats may be trying to repeat their past successes. Time will tell if they're successful, though. Allison?
So, Jane, there are less than 2 weeks left in this special session. What happens if the voting bill doesn't pass before it's over?
They start all over again. This is why Democrats are going to, push every point of order, every delay tactic. It starts to feel a little bit like Groundhog Day. But if they start again, if they delay it past that 2 weeks, they have to start all over again. That means more public hearings. That means the same thing we're doing today. And they have to reintroduce it. It's essentially just a bureaucratic effort. But eventually Republicans can push it through if they can get the quorum and they can they have the votes at the end of the day.
All right, we got a couple of weeks. Let's see what happens. Jane, thank you so much.
Thanks, Allison.
I'm not done. I'm the 6th fastest woman in this game ever.
Dead last, but not done. Sha'Carri Richardson with an incredibly disappointing finish at the Prefontaine Classic. Her first race since she was banned from the Tokyo Olympics for a positive drug test. Here's NBC News correspondent Stephanie Gosk.
9 talented women on this track right now, but the world thinking this is Richardson versus the Tokyo podium in the women's 100.
It was the showdown that fans had been hoping for at the Olympics.
Here comes Sha'Carri. Richardson's going to Tokyo, 10:87.
Sha'Carri Richardson won the U.S. Olympic trials in spectacular fashion, but was suspended for a positive marijuana test before the games, telling Savannah at the time she took responsibility but asked for empathy.
Sitting here, I just say, don't judge me because I am human. I'm you. I just happen to run a little faster.
On Saturday, she was up against 2 of the greatest sprinters in history, 2-time Olympic champion Shelley Ann Fraser-Price and gold medalist Elaine Thompson-Herah, who won the race.
Richardson being left behind.
Even as viewers of the race saw Nike commercials featuring Richardson,
I'll be at the finish line.
She finished dead last, stepping in front of the microphones in an interview that went viral.
This is one race. I'm not done. You know what I'm capable of. Count me out if you want to. Talk all the you want, because I'm here to stay.
It's been a bumpy road for the star runner, but as she told Tom Yamas right before the race, the experience has made her stronger.
It gives me more to show the world that I'm here to stay. At the end of the day, I didn't make a mistake, but that doesn't take away from my talent.
Even after the disappointment this weekend, looking to the future.
Congrats.